Okay, so let's dive right in. Some folks here probably know who you guys are and what you do. Some folks here probably don't know who you guys are and what you do. I guess to start, I want to know when, for both of you, was the point, the sort of breaking point, the sort of waking up point when you were like, I need to dedicate myself to changing this culture, to changing Silicon Valley. And in telling that, kind of explain where you were at the time when that point happened.
Yeah, I mean, it is, history is always clean in retrospect. I have been in the tech industry for nearly 13 years, so I have seen some stuff, right? Like I started when people didn't have laptops to take home and Google used Outlook, right? So there's been a lot going on in the time I was there, and my career focused on building large-scale systems to measure internet performance. So basically my job was figuring out the sort of infrastructure and the methodologies by which to create data that would sort of, be able to tell us how these things were working. And what I quickly bumped into was the fact that what I was doing was, irreducibly political, right? The decisions about which methodologies to use, how to measure, how to create data, and how to assign it meaning that then would inform policy or inform decisions at the company was a political decision. There was no sort of hard objective ground on which we could stand. So this, this was something that was really interesting to me. It was around that time, like 5 years ago, when the big kind of like AI hype started percolating, right? Everyone wanted to use machine learning, like we're gonna predict genocide using machine learning. That was a literal project someone pitched me from a university. There were efforts to use machine learning to sort of diagnose healthcare, et cetera, and I was really concerned about this data, right? Because what I was seeing—
You were inside the company seeing how much was being collected.
Right, how much was being collected, and in my role, I was trying to collect, the lowest level of the stack, seemingly the most sort of objective and non-social data. What I was seeing was data that was basically formed by people's assumptions about the world being used to sort of make models of the world that were incomplete, that were skewed, and that were then going to be sort of commodified for corporate profit based on claims to sort of benefit and sort of good use that weren't validated anywhere. And so I started raising the alarm. There's a long story there. I trained myself to speak publicly in august circles such as this. I did a lot of work to get the word out. And that escalated to founding AI Now, which was a research institute that could tackle these problems at NYU outside of the tech industry, sort of drawing on disciplines and perspectives that were not in the rooms in Mountain View or Sunnyvale or Seattle.
Well, still being in the tech industry, which I want to get to later on. Then Tristan, when were you like, oh my God, I need to become, because both of these guys are tech insiders who kind of became aware of the problems in Silicon Valley and now are leading movements to really rectify or to fix the direction that everything's going in.
Yeah.
So when was your moment?
For me, I was, in 2013, I was at Google. They had bought our company called Apture, and I was there as a product manager with the Gmail team, and I was watching the rise of sort of all the social media companies, Path, Instagram. My friends in college started Instagram. And the whole thing was just turning into this arms race for how to manipulate human nature, what we call the race to the bottom of the brainstem to suck attention and drill attention out of human bodies. This is not the thing that got me or many of my friends into the tech industry. Yeah. And I was there at Google, and I thought for sure, I was actually, so inside the Gmail team, email's a pretty taxing product. It's not always great for people's well-being. And I was in the room with the designers, and I thought if there was any room in the world where people would care about our impact on society with email, like where would that room be?
Because no one likes email.
Well, it's distracting, it's addicting, it's a slot machine. You pull it, you check it again. A minute later, it's a mess. It shreds your cognition. You think you want to write one email, and you get a new one, you switch back. There's all these subtle things that are just going on there. And I thought if there was one room that people would care about this, it would be the Gmail design team.
Of course.
And then I found out that the decision-making and thinking going on in that room didn't include our impact on society in that conversation. And it wasn't because they were evil, greedy people or something. They just weren't thinking about it. And I got concerned that the whole industry was in this just eroding people's relationships, changing teenagers' mental health, affecting 2 billion people's attention every day. So I went home every night for about 3 to 4 weeks after work, and between like 7 p.m. and midnight, I would work on this presentation that basically said, it was a slide deck, and I sent it at the end of this 3-4 week period to 10 people for feedback. It said, never before in history have 50 designers in San Francisco, within 50 miles of San Francisco, shaped what 1 billion people's thoughts and actions are going to be every single day. That if you affect people's attention, because thought precedes action, you're going to affect people's choices. From the moment you wake up and you set your alarm, you undo your alarm to the moment you go back and you set your alarm, we're totally jacked into this invisible system of psychological influence.
Yeah.
And this presentation ended up going viral to several hundred people, and I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I just knew that something was wrong, and tried to change the system from the inside at Google for a couple of years, and ultimately left to start a nonprofit on the outside because we really needed the external pressure to raise alarm bells about these issues.
Yeah. What was it like when you were talking about this, when you were saying sort of it's a race to the bottom of the brainstem, when you were fighting against the data collection? Like 2 years ago to now, there's been a shift. What happened? Like, tell me about some of the pushback you guys got in the beginning, or sort of how you've noticed the change.
I mean, again, it's hard to track. I want to actually back up and sort of connect the issues that Tristan works on with sort of what I work on.
Yeah.
So I look at the impact of AI systems, throughout our core social domains, right? And what's happening is you're seeing these sort of technologies, the social media, the Gmail, they, basically sort of steal our attention, to misquote Tristan. And in the process, they're collecting scads of data, right? They have our location history, they have other sort of apps usage, they're able to sort of model our psychological profiles correctly or not based on this. They are then moving into the industry of selling these models for sort of generalizable purposes in core social domains. So we have AI models that are deciding where your children get into school, which types of health benefits you'll get, whether you get a loan or not, what kind of medical diagnosis you might come away with, et cetera,
Yeah.
all based on this data. So you're looking at sort of technologies of social control across 2 axes. One is they're sort of controlling attention, controlling our time, sort of steering us towards certain things and not others. The other, they are actually shaping who gets resources, who gets access, who gets sort of privilege at a time where we're seeing some sort of the kind of a number of social crises on the horizon. So I think we need to look at the sort of surveillance that is perpetrated through the attention economy and connect that with the commodification of surveillance capitalism through the sale of these AI models to effectively make highly sensitive decisions and predictions that are shaping our social landscape.
Yeah, and I think there's another connection with just what's really going on is we've privatized, as Mark Andreessen said, software is eating the world. And if you think about software eating the world, it means that we don't regulate technology. So what we really mean is deregulation is eating the world. So take any section of public life, Saturday morning cartoons for kids. We used to call that a national park. We protect what happens Saturday morning for kids. There's rules about advertising. Just like rip that off, let YouTube for Kids gobble that whole thing up. Totally deregulates the entire thing. Last night there was an article about how there's popular videos on YouTube for Kids that actually teach kids how to commit suicide. This just came out yesterday.
I mean, YouTube Kids is a nightmare.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
a mess.
the thing is they can't actually manage it because it has unmanageable complexity. There's 2 billion Truman shows, 2 billion individually programmed channels, and they cannot actually control or regulate what happens on them because how many engineers at Facebook or YouTube speak the 22 languages of India, where there's an election coming up?
How big is the movement that you guys are building? Like, how many allies are you finding? Like, you're in Google right now. You're working there. They send you a paycheck. How are they supporting you, kind of criticizing them, or are you guys? What does it feel like right now to be fighting against these companies?
It's tricky, right? I think there are thousands of allies. I was one of the organizers of the walkout, right? 20,000 plus people walked out at that moment. There has been a growing tech worker movement that I have also been a part of that has been pushing back against sort of the lack of established practices of accountability. I think people are recognizing that there are issues and recognizing they want to change it. Now, has the objective function of these corporations changed? They're still major corporations at a time of sort of neoliberal capitalism that are optimizing their, products for shareholder value, right? And I think what we're seeing is a collision of
can we ever expect Google to be good or to not want to, if they can put videos for children and sell videos for 2-year-olds, without keeping them in a walled garden. How can we expect them not to?
That's the problem, is that they've locked themselves into a position. They can't, I mean, they could just shut it down, right? They could say, okay, we've got bad stuff happening, the Tylenol model, we've got poison in our thing, we're gonna take it off the shelf, we're gonna go to work for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I can't remember how long it took them. They put it back on the shelf, their stock price tanked in the moment when they did that,
Yeah.
but then it actually raised higher on the other end, because they were able to solve
They
the
were like
problem.
responsible.
And they were responsible, and they gained trust. What we have in the tech industry is a kind
But
of a
pharmaceuticals
gaslighting,
are-
saying there's no problem.
Yeah, pharmaceuticals are like very heavily regulated. A lot of these tech companies, what we're trying to, like, it seems to be what's happening is people are hoping that a conscience is developed or some sort of like shame. But
Those are the tools we've had to use to create pressure now. We were talking yesterday about how 2 years ago we couldn't even get people to acknowledge the problems.
Yeah.
Mark Andreessen, to go back to the Mark Andreessen thing, I spoke at a conference a year and a half ago, said all these same things. He came up right after me and said, everything Tristan just said is completely false. And now
you're onto something good.
he's on the board of Facebook, so there was a defense he had to occupy. But now we're at the point where people don't say that. They know that the issues are there,
Yeah.
and that issue does create a conscience. But is this the mechanism by which we want democratic accountability? Do we want nonprofits and researchers, people that I know who work with, who stay up till 3 in the morning and then send Kevin Roos an email at the New York Times saying, hey, I found this thing that, this is a thing that YouTube is recommending, and then they write the story, and then the guys at Facebook are like, look, see, when there's a problem, Kevin Roos will report it, and then it'll get fixed. And it's like, that's not the system of democratic accountability that we need.
It's
for
like a
conscience.
whack-a-mole shame model.
Yeah.
It's like
And we don't want shame to be the accountability mechanism. How do you change the core incentives of these products to actually act for the public good and not lie and say that they are incentivized to? So you have private incentives colonizing public spheres. We have to align the private incentives to be actually for the public good. And that's the big question we have to answer.
Yeah. What are things, where would you want to see more people rebelling? Like, where would you want to see more employees or more software engineers at X company rebelling against X activity? Like, where, I know we talked about YouTube Kids a little bit, but what else right now needs to be highlighted?
I mean, I think, sort of, it was mentioned on stage briefly with Brad just now, but the persistent discomfort among these tech employees that they don't know what they're working on and don't know where their work is being applied. I think we need people to begin to demand, the right to understand what they're contributing to, as we move from a time when the user of technology was you and me on our laptop slugging to Gmail, to the US military, to big oil, to these massive interests that are now sort of licensing infrastructure and AI models as the primary profit model for tech, right? And I think if we begin to push on, I deserve the right to know that I am not contributing to weapon systems that, as perhaps a non-US citizen, would harm my family and community in wars I don't believe in. I deserve the right to know that I am not contributing to sort of climate change by building models that will be used to make, fossil fuel extraction more efficient, right? I think these things are things we should just, think of as fundamental labor issues. And as we push on them, we demand the kind of accountability that right now doesn't even exist within these companies, let alone at a sort of democratic and public scale. And that's what we need. We should not have private interests making decisions that are so socially and geopolitically significant, that are shaping our politics and our access to resources.
But someone could say, like, well, DARPA, the military funding was what started Silicon Valley. Why now is everyone up in arms about?
Because Silicon Valley has massively commercialized that, right? You have a handful of individuals from a very monolithic and narrow culture at a specific point in time making reductionist theories about the rest of the world that are ultimately meant to drive profits, even if that's not what each individual decision is based on.
And again, the new thing being, compared to 20, 30 years ago, technology is eating up every single area of public life. Elections are being determined by the algorithms that Facebook happens, how the dials are set for that year, for that country. Whether a society feels outraged or not is because Facebook happens to set the dials to say, hey, we don't really make a distinction between negative emotions spreading 6 times faster than positive emotions. We didn't have technology eating up every area of public life, from our elections to our media, to our culture, to our public sphere, to our conversations, to our children's development. These are all areas of life that technology has gobbled up and replaced in its image this more complicated view. The sort of Santa Fe Institute view on this is the complex is sort of the invisible billion sort of evolutionary micro ingredients that make a soil fertile. And the complicated is when you optimize for one thing. You want this one outcome. So what humans are doing is we're taking our reductionist brains and then building reductionist AI to take the complicated soil, the complex soil that has all these micronutrients, and replacing it with this debased, more fragile, less self-repairing, not self-regenerative, more vulnerable model. And we're doing that across every area of society, optimizing for one outcome, which is good at getting those outcomes, but then actually ruins all these other invisible things that we're supporting the infrastructure that we live by.
Yeah. When I think about this, I get daunted by the power of it. Like, I read about what's happening in China where there's social scores. I look at, Facebook and Google. It's not like these companies are struggling. They're soaring and becoming more and more powerful. Is the solution to kind of wall ourselves off? Like, I don't know. If we're saying that these companies are trying to harm us, what do we do with that? Like, what's the next step?
A couple mundane solutions, right? Like, we need regulation. This is not, even Brad Smith is saying we need regulation.
Yeah, but you see the hearings where the people are asking Mark Zuckerberg questions. They don't, it's...
Sure. We don't need
like
regulation as a one, blanket category like an omnibus bill. We need, make them open up trade secrecy provisions so we can audit these systems when they're used in public life, right? Make them disclose all of the contracts they have with other businesses where they're applying, say, facial recognition to the purposes of law enforcement, right? Make them apply truth in advertising laws to the claims made about AI's benefit. Because right now what we're seeing is AI, the story we know about AI, this sort of like magical force that's going to transform for good or ill, we will discuss, is being told by the marketing departments of these corporations. We don't know what's happening. The things that we see, the sort of pitfalls, are the product of whistleblowers, Cambridge Analytica, Dragonfly, IBM's Watson snafu, right? IBM's creating facial recognition that detects race for the NYPD. All of these are either freedom of information requests or whistleblowers. These are not things that the companies are disclosing to anyone willingly.
These
what
are
we
a handful
see
of
is
issues,
marketing.
A handful of issues compared to the millions of other issues
that we don't know.
We don't know
When you
about.
walk around the Google cafeteria, do people just like close their laptops and like scurry away?
Not everyone.
Run
I can't
for
usually
it?
find a seat though. No, I think like this is, no one wants to be complicit in this, right? Like it's not, these aren't like some monstrous people who are hoping not to be called out. These are people who are sort of, enmeshed in a complex system, and a lot of them are really unhappy about it.
Which is why changing how people think about these issues and seeing the inherent complexity and harm that can arise. No one wants to do harm. None of the people that I know in Silicon Valley want to be doing any harm. So I never accuse anybody through their motivations. And I think this is why, with your work, you have written the article about how students don't want to go work at Facebook in this sort of upcoming crop. Creating an HR crisis where have everybody seeing this the same way and saying, I don't want to work at an extractive company. I think we're going to look back and say there's the extractive companies where they were extracting, from surveillance capitalism, the data and attention out of the society and actually polluting downstream, privately profit, publicly harm, versus the regenerative companies, things that actually replenish and regenerate the social fabric. And we need business models and incentives that align with that. And we almost, if you think of a regulation perspective, if the cheapest and most profitable and efficient thing to do is to create these unmanageably harmful and complex systems, and that's just cheaper and more profitable than doing the manageable, harder, slower curatorial process, of course it's going to go that way. But just like we have a carbon tax, could we have or we want a carbon tax, we could have a tax that says we don't want these unmanageably complex systems that have these bad outcomes to be as cheap as they are now.
Yeah. Or to be allowed to remain as secretive as they do now.
Yeah. And as we say, on the hearing side, by the way, if I were Mark Zuckerberg, I would have wanted to pay for that one question at the hearing to be asked to me, because that's all people remember from that hearing. Notice, right? He designed the memory of the entire culture. So what do you remember about Congress? You remember just that one question. How do you make money? Senator, we sell ads, right?
Yeah.
That little moment, just boom. Now everybody thinks, okay, Congress is incompetent. We shouldn't do anything with them. They clearly don't get it. If I was Facebook, I would pay to have that happen.
Yeah.
Right? Because I just designed the memory. This is what Trump does too. It's like you buy the memory of, you want people to remember a certain thing. Senator Mark Warner's policy paper is actually pretty good. There's some good ideas in there. I recommend people look at it. And there's other people, Blumenthal, many different senators actually have some good policy ideas. just because a couple people ask some unfortunate questions doesn't mean there's not some good balance that can happen there.
Yeah, you're holding out on DC, really stepping in here? Really
No, well, I mean, even just getting the hearings to happen.
Yeah.
When Roger McNamee, whose book Zucked just came out, who's Zuckerberg's mentor, if you haven't seen it, he talks about when our first meetings to Washington and getting just these first hearings to happen, getting Apple, Google, and Facebook, sorry, not Apple, Google, Facebook, Google,
Just
Twitter.
even see them physically sitting and answering questions.
Correct. The pressure
Because and
creates the accountability, and that just forces, you cannot phenomenologically as a human in a body walk into that environment and not feel a new set of accountability than you could have outside of feeling that, right?
Yeah.
And that pushed a lot of this into the public conversation and moved it from this abstract thing that we could ignore. So I mean, if you take it back, I think Facebook was criticized for a decade, often in, let's say, uninformed ways by the media, and especially in the early days. And so they learned culturally to completely ignore criticism. They just stopped paying attention. They literally, if you talk to people, they'll say, we just don't want to pay attention to the press because they don't have the inside story.
These companies have also created like intensely secretive, insular, almost cult-like
Correct.
cultures. Like you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you play your sports with your colleagues, you go to the doctor, you go everything, like all of that. Over the years, that begins to shape a mind and shape a person. You marry your...
I've actually spent years going into cults to study how they operate, and the parallels are
yeah,
really,
like your
really crazy.
Faceanniversary at Facebook. The year you joined Facebook, the celebration of that day is more important than your birthday.
Yeah.
Like this is...
In cults, they call it a love bomb. So when you enter, they basically give you so much love that you feel so welcome and so supported, and it's like the family you never had that now you don't want to leave.
Yeah.
There's sort of the excommunication thing, like in Scientology. If you leave, we disconnect. They call it disconnecting. So if you leave or speak negatively about these companies, then they disconnect you.
Well, the punishment.
Facebook.
I mean, I'm sure you see that with the people who do speak out, then being punished, and.
Yep.
Although
Tristan's like, I can't go to the Battery anymore.
Well, I was going to say, actually, I mean, you asked, what's it like if you sit down in a cafeteria? Do people feel like they run away or something like that? And I actually find that for our work, when you speak honestly, openly, and clearly about the actual structural issues, and you're not judging anything, you're not saying, and this is the problem, and this is the problem, you're just saying, these are the structural issues, we have allies throughout the whole industry.
Yeah.
Because no one wants bad outcomes. No one wants to be contributing to a system where kids have crappy mental health. No one wants to contribute to a system where you destabilize democracies or cause genocides across the world. You just have to have the clarity that sees why the current incentives will structurally lead to those outcomes. And once people see that, they actually say, gosh, how can I help? Which is why the inside activism that Meredith is doing such a great job leading makes such a big difference. But again, do we want that to be the system of accountability? It's almost like we don't have a democratic system and we have to hack it and be creative and find these internal power sources to create the accountability we want.
And just like hope to God that Google doesn't, I mean, that they keep you around. I mean, we're hoping that these capitalist companies listen for no reason.
Sure, but there is actual pressure, and the sort of economies of these companies are such that they're, especially sort of highly trained engineering talent is sort of rare and valuable, right? So there's leverage that doesn't exist at sort of a general scale. I think there's also just like a history of labor organizing that we can draw on. Like a lot of the old techniques are actually turning out to be, fairly useful here. But I agree. I think this is a lever that we need to be using because right now there are so few people who actually see the insides of how these companies work.
Yeah.
However, I think these people, and I would count myself among them, are sort of uniquely ill-positioned to understand the sort of scope of the damage, right? They're in conference rooms making sort of assumptions about the utility of their technologies. These then get deployed in sort of diverse environments, and there's no feedback loop at this point between the deployment of a facial recognition system by a sort of biased police department and the engineers who sort of trained the system to do X or Y. And this is why, at AI Now, like one of my big moves was I need to found along with Kate Crawford, a research institute that is outside of tech and that explicitly draws on perspectives that are not technologists, right? That are going, to answer the question about is this harmful, you don't ask an engineer who has sort of modeled harm algorithmically. You ask the people in a community who are being policed by these systems, or you ask the patients at a hospital who are being diagnosed and sort of bearing the outcomes. We need to remodel tech if tech is going to infiltrate our society the way it is, as a massive sort of democratic participatory exercise. We cannot think about this as the domain of technologists because I would say 90% of the assumptions they're making, they don't have the training to make. We need this to be an interdiscipline.
Or even
and
the
we
exposure. There's a great principle.
Both, yeah.
The people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And that's a big miss right now, is that people in Burma don't get to sit in the product decision-making room at Facebook. I just wanted to say one last thing, because I know we're out of time, which is, does public awareness change these pro-capitalist incentives? We were able in the last year to go from a race to the bottom of the brainstem to grab human attention to, the last year, Apple and Google have both launched well-being initiatives, where they're now in a race to the top because of the issues that were raised about addiction. Now they're competing. If you've seen these screen time management features and turning your phone grayscale automatically, a billion without shipping a line of code ourselves, a billion smartphones are going to be running features that are now two companies, Apple and Google, are competing to show who cares more about the fabric of society. So we've been able to flip it from a race to the bottom to a race to the top. But how does that happen? By changing how people think and creating a public consciousness that now the companies are forced to respond to. But
making people aware of how they were thinking, how these companies were
and consumers have to understand it, and we have to move the goalpost from addiction to actually saying the entire fabric of society. How do we actually care for that? How do we set off a race to the top for that? That's the sort of business-aligned way to try and hack it together.
You guys, this was fantastic. You two are wonderful speakers, and thank you so much for coming and talking, and thank you guys for being here, and the candles for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you.